It's good to see everyone tonight. If you're visiting with us, we're so glad to have you in our assembly. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule and coming to encourage us, and trust that you will be encouraged by the songs that we're singing and our prayers and our praise and our study of the Word, and then the chance to just visit and talk with one another and greet one another per the biblical instruction to do so, and just the joy that means to be able to be together as God's people. Thank you for encouraging all of us. It's good to have the Banks with us. Known them a long time. A couple ladies from Dowling Road came to see us in Tennessee this summer, and others. I've just thank you all for being a part of our assembly. And I want to thank you for bringing Tennessee weather here today. I love the fall in Southeast Texas, Gulf Coast, Texas. It's just so perfect. 60 degrees, slight breeze. I know it's like this every day. I know that because we lived in Baytown for a couple of years. So I know how that is. And so when you get a day like today, it's just sort of refreshing. I enjoyed it. Hope you did too. I want you to open your Bibles tonight to the book of Proverbs. Proverbs, the 4th chapter. And I want to begin reading in verse 1 of Proverbs chapter 4, where this parent, this father, and he does it in the first 7 chapters of Proverbs, talks to his son about life. So it is a parent talking to a child just about life stuff. And we can read any of the 7 chapters, but I've chosen the 4th chapter, and we'll read about half of it. Proverbs 4, beginning in verse 1. Hear, O sons, the instruction of a father, and give attention that you may gain understanding. For I give you sound teaching. Do not abandon my instruction. When I was a son to my father, tender and the only son in the sight of my mother, then he taught me, and he said to me, let your heart hold fast my words and keep my commandments and live. Acquire wisdom, acquire understanding. Do not forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, that is wisdom, and she will guard you. Love her, and she will watch over you. The beginning of wisdom is get wisdom. And with all of your acquiring, get understanding. Prize her, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a garland of grace, and she will present you with a crown of beauty. Hear, my son, and accept my sayings, and the years of your life will be many. I have directed you in the way of wisdom. I have led you in upright paths. When you walk, your steps will not be impeded, and if you run, you will not stumble. Take hold of instruction and do not let go. Guard her, for she is your life. These are tough times to be a parent. We are up against an onslaught of Satan culture, unprecedented in our lives. And it is so easy for us as a parent, it is so easy to just check out. It is so easy as parents to adopt the mindset that says, hear no evil, see no evil, I don't want to know. And a lot of parents today do that. And so the choppy waters of the single-digit years become full-fledged Class 3 and Class 4 rapids when our kids hit the tween years, 10, 11, and 12. and then become full-fledged Class 4 and Class 5 rapids when they hit the teen years. And what's really sad is some parents just give up. And some parents just give in to go along because it's easier that way. Because we don't want the hassles. We don't want our child to be mad at us. God forbid that would ever happen. We don't want our child to be deprived of apparently what everybody else in the United States of America has at their age. And so we just give in. There is a definite cultural shift in the way parents parent these days. And I don't know when that started. This societal shift of authority in the home, shifting from the parents to the kids. But in many families, what the kids want, what the kids think, what the kids like, is more important than the parental guidance, the kind of which we just read in Proverbs chapter 4. And so let the kids decide becomes the mantra of 21st century parenting. So how do I as a parent navigate these upside down times in which we live? How do I raise my kids without losing my mind? How do I train up a child in the way he should go when culture throws up roadblocks at every turn? I think one thing we have to understand is to take a big step back and understand that, in fact, it's not really new. In Isaiah's day, hundreds of years before Jesus, Isaiah said, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. Woe to those who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness." So apparently in Isaiah's time, there was a lot of this going on too. But it's all new to us because this is where we are. These are our times. These are the only ones we have. And we live in a culture in which one child psychologist said, and he wrote a book by this title, "The Collapse of Parenting." The absolute collapse of parenting. And if you think that you can solve the problem by making your kids come to church and sit 2 or 3 times a week, that's just going to solve everything, you are woefully naive. I want to show you a verse in Nehemiah. I'm going to give you time to get there. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 14. Nehemiah 4 and verse 14. Nehemiah is rebuilding those walls around the city of Jerusalem. And the people were getting discouraged. The enemy seemed to be throwing up roadblocks at every turn. And so Nehemiah challenges his people in Nehemiah 4 and verse 14. And he says, "When I saw their fear, I rose and I spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people." And this is what he said: "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, fight for your sons, fight for your daughters, fight for your wives, fight for your homes." Some things, ladies and gentlemen, are worth fighting for, and our families are one of those things. So if I'm going to raise up children to serve God, then I've got to fight for them. So I'll tell you what I want to do tonight. I want to talk about the culture in which we live in regard to a couple of aspects. There's lots of ways we could go with this. But I want to talk about the culture in which we live in regard to two areas that's just thrown in our face now constantly. And that's the culture of sexuality and the culture of disrespect. So I want to talk about both of those things, and then I want to end tonight by giving you some practical things that as parents you and I can do to counteract all of that. So the culture of sexuality and the culture of disrespect. So let's talk about the culture of sexuality we live in. Do you understand that the internet and the smartphone has changed everything? Do you understand that when your child holds a smartphone in his or her hand, do you understand the power of that device is over 1,000,000 times greater than the power of the best NASA computers during the Apollo space program? Do you understand that? And I know it's a worn-out cliche, I get it. But Houston, we got a problem. And we got a big one. Pornography runs rampant. And the age at which our children are introduced to that, and they're introduced to that so easily and so readily, but the age at which they're introduced to that is almost unimaginable. Pedophilia, child trafficking. When we adopted our children out of Eastern Europe, they were already after Leah. Our daughter was 15 at the time, and they were already after her. You have to understand over there that when the Soviet Union pulled out, the mafia came in. And the girls in the orphanages are just so easy targets. They know exactly when they're going to age out, and they're waiting for them literally at the gate, because those girls have nowhere to go. And you can get 10,000 American dollars for one. And somehow they found out who we were and that we were coming to get her. And the threat started coming against our lives that if we came over there, we wouldn't be going home. Because they were not about to lose one that was so easy, for which they could make a lot of money. But we went anyway. But I want to tell you, sex trafficking is not limited to East Europe. Child trafficking is everywhere. The availability of evil, scams. Let me show you another verse. Maybe you missed this one. In Romans 1 and verse 30. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 30. In that list where Paul in Romans 1 is talking about all kinds of sinful things. In this list he talks about unrighteousness and wickedness and greed in verse 29, and evil and envy and murder and strife and deceit and malice and gossips and slanderers and people who hate God and insolent and arrogant and boastful. And then he adds this, and I underlined it in my Bible: inventors of evil. Inventors of evil. What does that mean? It means that every time you think Satan has already invented all of the evil that could ever be invented, he finds a new way to market his product. That was true in the first century. That's true in the 21st century. And guess who is target number one? It's our kids. It's our kids. And, quote, Christian kids are just as susceptible as everybody else. And it's killing our families. And the latest cult worship, and I use those terms, the latest cult worship is the religion of perverted sexuality. We preach sermons and talk about homosexuality and bisexuality. Now we're having to talk about transsexuality. Can girls become boys? Can boys become girls? We live in a culture that says yes. We live in a culture in which the biological differences, culture says the biological differences between boys and girls don't matter. And yet we understand the God-designed truth from the very beginning. That God-designed nature tells the truth. And it tells the truth even when people don't want to hear the truth. There was a professor at the University of Tennessee, and that professor got angry and because the interviewer was using the word truth in regard to transsexuality and what we're talking about here. And he stopped him and said, "Don't use that word. It is offensive. The word truth is transphobic." That's where we live. That's our times. So here's my question. Who assigns gender anyway? And do we get to choose our gender regardless of biology? You know, I don't think biology has changed. I don't think reality has changed. What has changed is our definitions. Because today, reality is whatever you want reality to be. If it's your reality, then that's your reality, and that's okay. And we take common sense, which isn't very common anymore, and we throw it out. We throw it out. All I've done since I've been here is eat. Good grief. Jeff took me out this morning and bought my breakfast, and we had a good time visiting. And I want you to suppose something. I want you to think about something. Suppose after services tonight, I say, "Jeff, I want you to come with me. I want to take you out in the parking lot. I want to show you something. I want to show you my new Tesla. I want to show you my new Tesla." And he says, "You got a new Tesla?" And I say, "Yeah, I got a new Tesla." And so we go out in the parking lot, and I show him my new Tesla, and Jeff's standing there going, "That looks like a Chevy truck." I said, No, that's a Tesla." Jeff's looking at that going, "Well, that's the only Tesla I've ever seen with a 6-foot bed." I said, No, it's Tesla. Jeff comes in, calls the elders together, gets you guys together, and says, "We got a problem. We got to send this guy packing, you know. He's lost touch with reality." There's a lot of people that's lost touch with reality. Lost touch with common sense. But ladies and gentlemen, there's a large segment of our young people that are struggling with gender confusion. And some of them are our kids. I'm just telling you. Because they get bombarded with that at every turn. And what we have to understand and what we have to communicate is that gender is not some kind of social construct. Gender is not something that you get to choose. You know, our physical selves are made up of chromosomes. And do you know every chromosome in your body, every chromosome is marked male or female, every one? You don't get to choose your chromosome identification. You don't get to choose that. And to think otherwise is foolish. And yet, our woke culture comes along, and the elites of our educational system, and our politicians, and our media, and all of the smart people, who are bent on telling our kids that you can be whatever gender you want to be. And that is wrong on so many levels. For one thing, it is absolutely impossible for our young people to have the mental capacity, to have the emotional capacity and maturity to grasp the long-term ramifications of all of that. And I tell you what's going to happen. I'm not all that smart, but I think I got this figured out. It's not going to be too long down the road. You're going to see suicides among young people go way up. And yet kids long to belong. Kids long to be a part. Kids long to find their community. Kids long to find their tribe. That's always been the case. But then you bring the internet into that. And suddenly there is born this cult worship of perverted sexuality. I want you to think about this scene. Here's a 55, 60-year-old man at a playground across the street from an elementary school. And this 60-year-old man on the playground across from the elementary school starts talking to these kids and saying the same things that are being said to the kids across the street inside the elementary school. You know he would be arrested as a pedophile. You know that. What's the difference? There's not any. Now, the good news is the majority of kids are going to make it through adolescence. They're going to survive. They're going to make it. The key is for you and me as their parents to be there for them, to build relationships with them, to keep the communication strong, to keep the bond strong, because they're up against a culture that is very anti-God. And this transgenderism denies the basic core truth of the Scriptures in the very beginning, that in the beginning God created them male and female. I was coming to the Southside Lectures back in June, and I'm driving across the Atchafalaya Swamp, you know, that 20-mile bridge. Anybody been across that 20-mile bridge? All right, I'm coming across the 20-mile bridge, and I'm listening to Sirius Radio. I've got that on. And they were doing an interview with Mayor Eric Adams, no relation, of New York City. And they were interviewing him about having drag queens coming into his school system. And this is what he said. In fact, I started to pull over on that bridge, but I couldn't. So I had to wait till I got to the hotel, and I went back and found the story and wrote it down word for word. Adams said, "Drag storytellers and schools that support them are advancing a love of diversity and personal expression and literacy, the core of what we as Americans embrace." I got a question. Isn't it amazing that any of us ever learned to read and write and do arithmetic without drag queens parading through our schools? Isn't that amazing? We learn stuff. Adams goes on and he says, the goal is not only for our children to be academically smart, but to be emotionally intelligent. Would you explain to me how a man dressed up in a cartoonish sexual costume helps children to become academically smart or even emotionally intelligent? How does that work? And you know the answer to that. In Ephesians chapter 5, I want you to listen to what Paul says. In Ephesians 5 and verse 11, Ephesians 5 and verse 11. Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they are exposed by the light, truth. For this reason it says, awake, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine upon you. Wake up, he says. Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are what? Evil. That's where we live. That's our time right there. We live in a culture of perverted sexuality. It's tough being a parent these days. And then there's the culture of disrespect. The culture of disrespect. And you could argue, I think, successfully that there is a measure of disrespect that has been going on for years among the generations. But because of technology, never to the extent that it is today. And I'll just tell you, parents are tired. We are tired of getting beat on. We are tired of getting beat up. We are tired of getting beat down. And watching our families spin out of control. One psychologist was writing, he said, and he gave her name as Cynthia. Cynthia was rude and hostile to her parents. Of course, she was charming to everyone else. But she obsessed about her privacy, insisting that her life was none of her parents' business. The result, her parents were not allowed to speak with her without being made to feel intrusive. The parents found it impossible to sustain any conversation with their daughter. So much for honor your father and your mother. I believe that was one of the top 10. I believe that was etched in stone, if I'm not mistaken. And by the way, there's no age expiration of that principle. Honor your father and mother. There's so much else we could say. Let me leave you with 7 things that I think will help all of us as parents in this crazy culture in which we live. It's upside down world. I'm going to give you 7 things to consider, to think about as a parent. Number 1, write this down. As a parent, you have to figure out your parental motivation. As a parent, you have to figure out your parental motivation. I say that because if you're parenting from a platform based upon the singular desire that I want my child to always like me, the odds are going to be really high that you're not going to obtain that objective. You see, your child expects to look up to you. There's something, and I don't know, I can't articulate it. There's something hardwired in us from the Creator. Your child expects to look up to you, but you have to earn that respect. And if you and I as parents continually cave in and give in and keep bailing them out over and over and over again, what we're going to earn from our children is not respect, but disrespect. So what is your parental platform? Well, I'll tell you what it needs to be. It needs to be to teach your kids right and wrong. That's your number 1 job, right? To teach your kids the difference between right and wrong. Who else is going to do it if you don't do it? To teach your children the responsibility that if you're responsible with a little, then you can be responsible with a lot. I think Jesus talked about that. To teach your kids to be respectful of everyone. To teach your kids that they have to own their stuff. They have to own their behavior. Quit blaming everybody else. Own it. Teach your kids that behaviors have consequences. But most of all, teach your kids to model the Lord Jesus Christ because they see it in you. And yet, even in the best of homes, there's going to be rough and bumpy. That's just the way it is. But if we approach raising our children in that way, then over time we can earn their respect because we parented them from a position of God-given authority, and we did not just hand that off to society. So you have to figure your parental motivation. Number 2, you have to teach your kids how to treat you. You have to teach your kids how to treat you. I've seen kids, you've seen kids in public places they're so disrespectful to their parents. And the parents just take it. Some kids disrespect their parents because the parents allow themselves to be disrespected. If you don't respect yourself, then what makes you think your child is going to respect you? And by the way, if they don't respect you, what makes you think they're going to respect the teacher at school? What makes you think they're going to respect their employer? What makes you think they're going to respect their spouse? It all starts with what we instill in them in regard to respect. And that gets back to that honor father and mother again. You got to teach them how to treat you. Number 3, allow them to survive their drama. Allow your kids to survive their drama. Whatever you do, do not be a helicopter parent. You know the helicopter parent. It's the parent that swoops in to rescue their child every time they make a bad decision. I'm not talking about something illegal. I'm not talking about something unsafe. That's not what I have in mind. What I have in mind is, how will our kids ever learn to think for themselves if we never give them the chance to do that? Do you understand, every morning, Monday through Friday, in schools all across this country, the front offices are filled with helicopter parents? Do you understand that? Some kid forgot his permission slip for the field trip. Here comes helicopter parent. Some kid forgot the right shoes for gym. Here comes helicopter parent. Some kid forgot their homework. Here comes helicopter parent with the homework the helicopter parent probably did. Bringing it in. Rescue, rescue, rescue. When we adopted the 3 kids, we were zoned for a big high school, huge high school. But out on the edge of our county, there's a little community of about 900 people, farming community. And the county lets them have their own school system, their own individual school out there. It's K through 12. There's only about 50 kids in each class. And so we explained to the Board of Education this particular situation with these kids growing up in this mountain orphanage in eastern Bulgaria, and that they're just going to be overwhelmed with this big school. Is there any way we could get them in this little school where it would be better for them? And they said, sure, that'll work. But he said, you'll have to take them there. It was 25 miles one way, 25 miles back, 25 miles in the afternoon, 25 miles back. We did that for about 5 years. But we would have some interesting conversations in the car. And one day we're driving along. I'm driving. Leah's sitting beside me. She was probably a junior in high school then. We're driving along, probably at about mile number 20. And all of a sudden, she says, Dad, stop the car now. And I thought, what? I pull over to the edge of the road and I stopped. I thought she was sick, the way she was carrying on. And I said, what's wrong? What's wrong? She said, oh, Dad, we've got to go home. We've got to go back home. I said, why? She said, I left my chapstick. I just looked at her. And I put the car in drive, and I drove the last 5 miles and put her out. And then there's the Black Hawk attack helicopter parents. They take it to a whole nother level. Their child is never going to face disappointment. Their child is never going to face discomfort. Their child is never going to face consequences for anything. And the Black Hawk attack helicopter parents will drop the smart bomb on any school teacher or any coach or any administrator who would dare throw a flag against my child's behavior or who would dare try to hold my kid accountable. What do you think we're teaching our kids when we do that? We better teach them how to survive their drama. And I'll tell you what not to do. I'll tell you what not to do is the very thing I've done, the very thing you've probably done. We've all done it. when our kids do something crazy, dumb, we invariably will look at them and say, "Why did you do that?" And invariably, you're going to get the same answer every time. You already know the answer. Oh, that's the answer you're going to get every time. Instead, what we need to do is rephrase that a little bit and kind of come in the back door and say, what do you think you should do about that? How do you think you could have handled that better? Or help me understand why that wasn't a really good decision. What are you doing when you do that? You're helping your child learn to think for himself or herself. And they're going to need to do that because you're not always going to be there. Number 4, you have to be okay even if they are not okay. And that's a hard lesson for us parents to learn. You have to be okay even if they're not okay. And I'll just tell you, all any of us can do is our best. And every one of us, if we went back in time, would love some redos, wouldn't we? None of us are perfect. I don't know any perfect parents. They don't exist. And if you think you're going to be the perfect one, you're in for a big disappointment. But eventually, as our kids grow up and make decisions, we have to understand that we did the best we could, and those decisions are on them. In Luke the 15th chapter, when Jesus teaches that story that we know so well of the prodigal, what is really interesting to me in that story is when that young headstrong boy decided to leave home, that father didn't chase him, did he? Dad didn't chase him. You think the father cared about his son? Guaranteed. You think the father prayed for his son? Yeah, I'm sure he did. We would. You think the father would hope that something might happen and get his son's attention and he came home? You think he would hope that? Well, I think by the action of the father later, that's exactly what he hoped. But the dad didn't just swoop down and rescue him. He had to trust God and wait and wait and wait. It's the old oxygen mask airplane principle. If you're traveling with small children, put the oxygen mask upon your face first and then your child. And what sounds so selfish really isn't. Because if you don't take care of you, how are you going to take care of them? One of the questions my wife asks a lot of her clients, she's a marriage and family therapist, and one of the questions she asks a lot of her clients, what are you doing to take care of you? That's a good question. What are you doing to take care of you? Number 5, you have to outpatient them. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4, love is patient. I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but teenagers love to spin stuff up. And they love to spin you up. So don't get caught in the spin cycle. Don't do that. Proverbs 15 and verse 1, a gentle answer turns away wrath. And so when the spin cycle gets too crazy, the blaming, the deflecting, the talking in circles, you need to say, I love you too much to talk about that right now. And when they walk off in a huff with their back to you and roll their eyes, you say to them, by the way, I love you more than you have eye rolls. And they're going to think, how'd she know? Number 6, you got to pick your battles. Not everything's worth a battle. But whatever you pick, you got to win. I love the mom whose son was needing to go to soccer practice, and she'd already told him, clean your room up before you go to soccer practice. And he comes bounding down the stairs, and she said, son, did you clean your room? He said, no, I haven't had time. When I get home from soccer practice, I'll clean my room. She said, that's not the agreement. She said, I only take boys to soccer practice who've cleaned their room. He said, Mom, come on, we're going to be late. If we don't go now, we're going to be late. She said, I only take boys to soccer practice who've cleaned their room. He said, Mom, if we don't go to soccer practice, if we're late, the coach is going to make me run laps. And she said, I only take boys to soccer practice who've cleaned their room. And he went back upstairs, and she said, I heard this sound I hadn't heard in so long. The vacuum cleaner started. And he cleaned his room, came downstairs. She said, I took him to soccer practice. And she said, I stayed through the whole practice. In fact, she said, I stayed to the very end. And she said, I kind of enjoyed watching him run all of those laps around and around and around. I have a therapist friend in Alabama, in Huntsville. She sent this today. Tough parenting requires that you tell your kids they need to clean their rooms before they can have a donut, while you sit there eating the donuts and yelling to them, better hurry, they're almost gone. I love that. That is great. And finally, number 7, you got to use your leverage. And I've seen too many parents the kids get to be teenagers and they think, well, I don't have any leverage. And yes, you do. As long as they live in your house and eat your food and sleep under your roof, you got leverage. You see, teenagers think sometimes that everything that they want is a right. But there's a big difference between rights and privileges. Kids driving a car is a privilege. Going out is a privilege. Having a phone is a privilege. Privacy of your room is a privilege. One girl said, it's my room, I can do whatever I want. No, that's not the way it is. Because your room's connected to my house. My house. We were having trouble with Alex, the middle child we adopted. He was getting a little out of whack. And so we tried different things, and I thought, I'm going to try something else. So I brought him home from school one day, and I stayed downstairs. He went up to his room, and I stayed downstairs. I just waited because I knew it was coming. And all of a sudden, from upstairs, I heard him yell, where's my door? And I yelled back. I stood there and looked at him up there, and I said, first of all, it's not your door. It's my door. And I borrowed it for a while. It's amazing. You have more leverage than sometimes you think you have. Do children have rights? Yeah. They have a right to be loved. They have a right to be fed. They have a right to be clothed. They have a right to have a roof over their head. They have a right to be protected. They have a right to be educated. But I'll tell you, beyond that, there's mostly privileges. And I'll tell you what worked with our daughter. Years ago when Sharon was in high school, I'll tell you what works. Christy, you're going to love this. Call the principal, call guidance, go through all the right channels, and then show up and eat lunch with her in front of all of her friends. And tell her, I can't wait to come and eat lunch with you tomorrow. And the next day. There probably won't even be a next day because you'll find an attitudinal adjustment. That's just the way that is. I want to close tonight in Deuteronomy chapter 6 where Moses is concerned for these young parents who are moving into the promised land, and he knows about the neighbors. He knows about the Canaanites, and he knows about the Canaanite culture and how they stood opposed to everything God stood for. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 6, he gets these young parents together. I hope you understand they're young parents because all the older ones have died in the wilderness. And he gets these young parents together in Deuteronomy chapter 6, and he says, this is the commandment, the statutes, and the judgments which the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you. God commanded this. Verse 2, so that you and your son and your grandson. A lot of these people didn't have grandkids. Some of them were old enough to, but a lot of them didn't have grandkids. Moses is talking about the future generations. And he says in verse 4, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You, circle in verse 5 and verse 6, all of the yous and the yours. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, your might. These words which I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart. Who's he talking to? Parents. Moses talking to parents. What's he saying? He's saying it's got to be in you. Don't try to give your kids something you don't have. Don't talk to them about doing right and following God and loving God and all that kind of thing if you don't. Kids can handle anything except one thing. There's one thing a child cannot handle. You know what it is? Hypocrisy. They can spot it. And that's when he says, you shall teach them diligently to your sons. That's structured learning. That's learning that's you thought out. And you shall talk of them. That's unstructured learning. That's the everyday conversations. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house at the table, when you walk by the way, when you're traveling somewhere, when you lie down, when they go to bed, when they rise up. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead, and write them on the doorpost of your house and on the gates. Write Scripture down, he says. But don't just write it down. Live it. Moses makes a plea to these parents who are moving into Canaanite territory. And he's saying to them, don't let culture control your kids. I wonder what Moses would say to us in the 21st century as we are surrounded by a Canaanite culture. Don't let them control your kids. May God help us as moms and dads. May God help us to do our best. May God help us to admit that we don't know everything. May God help us to keep learning. And then may God help us to apply what we learn in our homes and to set the right example in front of our kids. And when we make mistakes, and we do, we all do, I do, you do, we all make mistakes. Own it. And then it's not on you, it's on them. My parents made mistakes. They made mistakes. But I love them with all my heart. My mom died in 1985. She was young. And I'd give anything to talk to her one more time. I went by the cemetery the other day. I was in Louisville, Kentucky, and I went by the cemetery. And I tell you, that's the coldest place. Love your parents. Realize they're not any more perfect than are you. And ask God to help you as you raise your kids. May He give us all wisdom, the kind of wisdom we read in the book of Proverbs in chapter 4. And may He help us set the right example in front of them. Well, I've talked long enough. Thank you all so much. You've listened so well. These are such tough times. We sing the song of invitation. If you're not a Christian, obey the gospel. Be buried in baptism for the remission of your sins. If you are, but you've walked away and you haven't been faithful, and you can change that. You can change that. We'll pray with you. We'll help you. We'll do whatever we can. Won't you come while we stand and sing?
Hark the gentle voice of Jesus.